This is the second part of the expansion of the church into the Roman Empire. In the previous section, we did talk about the preparation of the gospel that occurred within the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries of the Common Era in the Roman Empire, particularly language and travel, but also religion. And I did want to go back to this notion of how the religious context influenced the development of Christianity, and really kind of how the message of Christianity then was received. What was the audience experiencing, and how did the gospel affect that? One aspect of the religion was this notion of a kind of a stair-step spirituality, where the adherent, the one who was to seek God through let's say one of the mystery cults, one of the mystery religions, the Mithras cult and the Isis cult were very prominent in the Roman Empire, as well as various temples and associations with the various Roman deities, popular to us through the stories of Greek and Roman mythology. And then in this context, the adherent would enter into a series of practices and rituals, working their way up, progressing toward either contact with the deity or some sort of initiation into becoming a fully devoted follower of this particular deity. And the deity would then be able to communicate with the adherents through a series of intermediaries. They could be angels, they could be priests, and this cycle was like just a continuing progression toward this deity. And it's interesting to me because this stair-step approach is very much what I would call, using more of a contemporary notion, the gamification of religion. In other words, that the adherent is trying to level up, trying to get to the next level, trying to progress one step further, one step closer to this deity. And this was the experience of many within the context of the early church, those who were within the communities of the early church. And so this was, what they primarily struggled with. Another struggle within this context was also persecution, in which near the end of the 3rd century CE, the Roman Emperor Diocletian tried to salvage the decimated empire, and he did so by centralizing the power, mainly by sending the army in to control various areas and provinces of the empire, and increasing taxation and demanding more from each of these areas, and also through cultural uniformity. Remember, religious practice wasn't primarily a moral issue or even a spiritual issue. It was a way to solidify support for the state, and without anyone who was countering the worship of these state gods was obviously a threat. Therefore, Christians became a threat. And this led to persecution. Christians were removed from civil service in the army near the end of the 3rd century into the 4th century, where the emperor ordered that all Christian buildings and writings were to be destroyed, and Christian leaders were then compelled to sacrifice to the state gods or to have their lives ended. This non-compliance obviously was a death sentence. Now, the fact that this was even done by the fact that there were writings to be destroyed, that there were buildings to be destroyed, that there were leaders to attack, showed that Christians in this time period were established, and also that there were prominent Christian communities within the Roman Empire, and especially in some of the larger cities. As we look further, Diocletian was replaced, and it was within only a few short years that thousands of Christians had died, especially in Egypt and North Africa, due to the persecution within the Roman Empire. It's interesting that as Galerius was lay dying of cancer, he lifted the persecution of Christians, and in fact asked Christians to pray for him. And so we see there was a connection between the religious context and persecution among early Christians within the Roman Empire. I do want to go back to this concept of this progressive movement toward the deity through intermediaries and priests, and it's interesting how these mystery cults that this was associated with also led to an attempt by some to understand Christianity this way, and this was the result. This resulted in the growth of Gnosticism as a heretical extension of parts of Christianity, and in fact, it was an attempt to try to make sense of Christianity through this dualistic Greek cultural worldview. And here are a few of the beliefs. Now, this was not Orthodox Christianity, but we see that the strong influence of Gnosticism in the 3rd and 4th centuries. In fact, many would say that there is a sense that the Gospel of John was written, and most of Johannine literature was written with an eye to communicating the gospel to communicate a correct gospel to those who may have been influenced by Gnosticism. So here are some of the primary beliefs of Gnosticism. It was dualistic in the sense that the spirit was considered good and that matter was considered evil. This is very familiar because we've already discussed the influence of Platonism and later Neoplatonism, and Gnosticism shows this clear attempt to distinguish between the spiritual and the material world, and that only the spiritual is good. Also, there was a belief that sin is basically matter, or the material, yielding to bodily appetites. Sin was not considered a spiritual conflict of disobedience, of going one's own way. It was merely the material yielding to the appetites. And if those appetites could be corralled, then somehow the person could then overcome those sins. Resurrection was viewed as the spirit escaping the prison of the body. Remember the soma sema that we talked about earlier? Yet Paul, when he wrote of the resurrection, did not see it this way at all. In fact, when he does talk about the resurrection, it's the talk of the physical body, the soma, being risen again, being made new and presented before God. It was a very real resurrection, not a metaphorical one. Yahweh, the God of the Jews, was viewed by Gnostics to not be the father of Jesus, because in their view a spiritual being could not create evil matter. And remember, all things in the material world were evil, so the incarnation would make little sense to the Gnostic. So in this sense, that Jesus and his presence on earth was docetic. In other words, according to the Greek word dokeo, Jesus only seemed to be human. And so the incarnation, again, was questioned, and basically the teachings of Jesus would be questioned, especially those that were related to material things, or those things in which miracles occurred and that could not be explained in a spiritual way. And so there was a complete rejection. The fact that Jesus sitting with the disciples and eating, that process would have been would have been impossible for a Gnostic to comprehend. And Scripture was viewed as a kind of a maze, a text that had to be sorted out, and that there were hidden messages within it, and only a few elite and well-educated teachers could then unlock this secret knowledge to those disciples who would be willing to submit to their teaching. And among the Gnostics, Plato would have been as authoritative as Paul. And so we have these beliefs to be very prominent, not among Christian groups, but kind of alongside Christian groups. And the Gnostics were structured in a way that organized cells of the spiritually elite, that only those who were willing to commit to this belief system, they did not necessarily have to make a change to their life, but they had to reorganize how they thought. In fact, in many ways, they just had to basically accept Jesus on their own cultural terms, which was very interesting to think of for that time, as well as to make connections to our time. Leaders were not considered those who were pastors, who cared for those in a spiritual way, but they were teachers, and they were teachers of the secret. They were purveyors of this secret knowledge, and so in their eyes, ignorance and fear would restrict the unenlightened, and so what was needed was an asceticism, or denial of the body, denial of bodily existence, but to remove oneself from the mundane daily life, or libertinism, where the body didn't really count, that one could act as any way they wanted to. Their body was just kind of a temporary prison, so they could do or act in any way. The immorality could be rampant, because what was important was that one held on to or practiced the secret knowledge. And so we have this distinction arise. We have the Christian rule of faith versus the Gnostic secret tradition. And so in response to this situation, we have the rise of Christian intellectuals and the development for the first time of theology, or a sense of a rule of faith, teaching passed down from the disciples. And in this early expression of Christian teaching, there was a strong acceptance of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and then later the New Testament books were finally recognized, about 386, 389 AD. The authoritative Scripture was that tradition which was given in written form, and the rule of faith was that which was promoted in spoken form through sermons and through the teaching from one Christian group to the next. And so we see the rise of a normative Catholic Christianity, Catholic in the sense of universal, that there was a sense of all Christians would then be able to live this way. All Christians could then view themselves as believing this way. There was a standardized liturgy, at least as early as AD 150. Justin Martyr talks about the elements of the teaching of the apostles, the singing of common psalms and hymns, and gathering together on the day of worship. We also have a sense of baptismal requirements, of initiation requirements needed for those who were entering into the Christian faith. And there was this initiation that lasted approximately 3 years, including a recitement of the state of faith just prior to baptism. And baptisms usually occurred on Whit Sunday, White Sunday, noting the baptismal robes that were worn. This would usually occur after the season of Easter, on the day of Pentecost. And also a recital and a belief in a particular creed, or the Latin word for I believe, the credo. So this creed was common. And how did this creed establish belief? Well, it clarified what Christians believed and how they lived these beliefs, and it made a clearer path toward the rite of baptism, and gave some strong reasons for belonging. There was also a sense that the church's teachings were then protected against heresy or contrary beliefs. Mark Knoll, in his book Turning Points in Christian History, chapters 2 and 3, described this in more detail, as well as Spickard and Craig, A Global History of Christians, chapter 3, goes into more detail here. But I do want to just touch on a few of these issues. The Apostles' Creed, originally attributed to the 3rd or 4th century AD, talks about the Father and the Maker of heaven and earth. This would be distinctly contrary to what the Gnostics taught, as the deity being pure spirit, trying to overcome the materialistic world. We also have this sense that Jesus was then born and also died on the cross, versus docetic teaching that Jesus only seemed to be enfleshed or interacted with the material world. Thirdly, the Christ meant the Messiah. In other words, there was no dispute about whether the Old Testament was relevant or important for Christians, that the Old Testament prophecies really did culminate in Jesus of Nazareth. And lastly, the Holy Catholic Church emphasized the universality of Christian unity, unlike Marcion and other subgroups that tried to limit their groups to the true believers. Rather, the creed said, this statement of belief shows what all Christians might believe, and it opened the door to those who, merely by trusting in their heart and believing with their minds, they could become Christians. And this concludes the second part of the expansion of the church into the